Okay, sir. Can we start, sir?
Yes, sir, we can start.
Yeah. So, good afternoon, everyone. I once again welcome Professor Joseph Dorai Raj. Sir was here with us yesterday, and I'm really grateful to Sir for he has made things so easy for me that whenever I was required to make any change in the schedule, I have contacted Sir and he has readily agreed for the changes. So on behalf of the participants and section of Nagpur University, sir, I welcome you to this session. And as sir was here yesterday as well, so I don't think there is any need to introduce sir now. And I request sir to take over the mic and start with his presentation. So over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to meet all of you. Yesterday, I spoke on canon, critiquing the canon. And today, I'll be talking about Derrida and deconstruction. So once again, I thank Professor Kapil Singhel for the warm invitation. Thank you, sir. So dear friends, I'll be making a PowerPoint presentation today. I'll be sharing my screen with you. I'm sorry, there is a problem with my laptop. Please bear with me.
वरचा थोडा भाग असा तोडला पाहिजे.
Hello. Okay, sir. Yeah, we have received your PPT. We will be sharing it.
Okay, sir. Okay, next, sir, next slide, please. Am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yes,
You are
sir.
audible.
Audible. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So dear friends, please take a look at this slide. This will give you an idea of today's presentation. So today's presentation is titled Derrida and Deconstruction, and the presentation is in 4 parts. In the first part of the presentation, I'll be talking about the circumstances that led to the birth of deconstruction. Where was deconstruction born? And in what context, in what situation, and what were the circumstances that led to the birth of deconstruction. So this would be the first part of my presentation. In the second part of the presentation, I'll make an earnest attempt to answer the question, what is deconstruction? How do we define deconstruction? So that will be the second part of the presentation. And in the third part of the presentation, I'll be talking about some of the strategies that we need to deploy when it comes to deconstructing a literary text. And towards the end, that is the fourth part of the presentation, we shall try to make an assessment of Derrida and his contribution, particularly to literary theory. So dear friends, this is how I have organized my presentation. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, fine. So dear friends, this slide, this is the first part of the presentation. This talks about the birth of deconstruction. Now may I draw your attention to the last 2 lines of this slide. So very briefly, I'll be talking about Ferdinand de Saussure. And all of us know, particularly those of us who teach linguistics, we know that Ferdinand de Saussure is considered or is hailed the father of modern linguistics. And he was a professor of language and linguistics at the University of Geneva, Switzerland. And he died at the age of 56. Very unfortunate. He died quite early. He died when he was only 56, and he died in the year 1913. So at the time of his death, he had written only 1 book, but immediately after he died, his students, his former students realized here was a brilliant man, here was a brilliant professor, and his classes were filled with brilliant ideas and insightful theories. And they realized, it dawned upon them that these concepts and these insights and these theories should reach a wide audience. Therefore, what did they do? They collected their class notes, collated them, put them together, edited them, and gave them a form and shape, and brought it out as a book bearing the title, A Course in General Linguistics. And this was in French. And please remember, this happened 3 years after Saussure's death. So therefore, it is a posthumous publication. And please remember, this book was originally published in French. Now, when did the English translation appear? Now, dear friends, we have 2 English translations. The first English translation was edited by Wade Baskin. And the second English translation was done by Roy Harris. Now, the first English translation, it appeared in 1959. The original book, the original version, the original French version appeared in 1916, but the English translation appeared in 1959. That was the first English translation. Then later in 1983, Roy Harris, he brought out the second translation of Ferdinand de Saussure's A Course in General Linguistics. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we will stop here. We will stop here, and then we will go to the first part of the slide. Now, from France, from Paris, let us go to let us go to New York and Baltimore. Okay, so let us travel to Johns Hopkins University, particularly the humanities wing at Johns Hopkins University called Johns Hopkins Humanities Center. I repeat, Johns Hopkins Humanities Center located in Baltimore. Uh, I was there in 2015, and it is a little more than 100 kilometers from New York. Okay, so let us go back to Johns Hopkins Humanities Center. In 1966, to be very precise, from the 18th of October to the 22nd of October 1966, the Humanities Wing of Johns Hopkins University, they had organized an international conference. They had organized an international seminar bearing the title, The Languages of Criticism and the Sciences of Man. So what was the title? What was the title of the international seminar that the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins University organized? It was called The Languages of Criticism and the Sciences of Man. It was a 3-day affair. It was a 3-day program. And who all attended the seminar? Who all attended this international seminar? We have Michel Foucault, we have Lucien Goldman, we have Todorov, we have the Belgian phenomenological critic Poulet, and we have Derrida, we have Lacan. So Derrida was one of the participants of this 3-day international conference organized by the Humanities Wing of Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore. Now, dear friends, here is an important question. The question is, why was this conference organized? What was the purpose of this conference? What was the objective of this conference? What did they want to achieve? Now, please remember the conference was organized in 1966, and the first English translation of Ferdinand is a course in general linguistics appeared in 1959. So, which means it was only in the early part of the 1960s, I repeat, it was only in the early part of the 1960s that the American colleges and universities had come to know about Saussure, about Saussurian linguistics, also known as structural linguistics and structuralism. Now, I would like to make my point very clear. It was only in the 1960s that American scholars, American academics, American professors and students alike were getting to know about Saussure, were getting to know about Saussurian linguistics, also known as structural linguistics. And that was the period wherein they had a brush with structuralism. So this happened in the early part of the 1960s. Even though Saussure's book, A Course in General Linguistics in French, was published in 1916, because the English translation appeared only in 1959, it crossed the Atlantic and reached the American shores only in the early part of the 1960s. Now, what happened was the Humanities Center at Johns Hopkins University, those people thought, why not organize an international conference? And why not invite experts from France and Germany, experts in Saussure, experts in structuralism? And the purpose of organizing this international conference was to initiate a dialogue or a conversation between the French and the German structuralists on the one hand and their American counterparts on the other. Okay, so dear friends, I think I have made it sufficiently clear. Now, let us take our own colleges and our own universities. Whenever we organize an important seminar, whenever we organize an important conference, what do? Immediately after the conference, imagine we have received some 100 papers or 120 papers. So what do? We scrutinize these papers, we keep aside certain papers, and then we select some 20 or 25 papers, edit them, both for content and for language, and then we bring it out as a book, the proceedings of the seminar, the proceedings of the conference. Now, similarly, this particular conference, organized in October 1966, it was organized by two professors, Please look at the second paragraph. And who were the organizers of this international conference? Maxi and Donato. So these were the two organizers of this international conference. And the proceedings of this international conference, they were published in the form of a book bearing the title The Structuralist Controversy. And this happened in 1970. And if you look at the preface, Maxi and Donato, the two organizers of this international conference, they make it very clear. Now, why did they organize this conference? They make it clear. I read. The purpose of the meetings rather was to bring into an active and not uncritical contact leading European proponents of structural studies in a variety of disciplines. This is one part, with a wide spectrum of American scholars. Okay, so dear friends, the point is, in the 90s, the American academics wanting to know more about Saussure and structuralism organized an international conference in October 1966. And this conference was organized by the humanities wing of Johns Hopkins University, and the chief organizers were Maxi and Donato. Okay, I repeat, why was the conference organized? What was the purpose of organizing this conference? Very simple. It was to know more about Saussure. In particular, it was to talk about, it was to discuss, it was to learn more about structuralism. I repeat, the conference was meant to disseminate ideas, concepts, and theories related to structuralism. Now, here is an important question. But what happened in the conference? What happened in the conference? I told you Jacques Derrida was one of the invitees. He was one of the participants in the conference. Now, dear friends, I want you to realize that something ironical happened, something disastrous happened. What happened? Jacques Derrida, in this international conference, he presented a paper bearing the title Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. So this was the paper that Derrida presented in this international conference, which was meant to talk about Saussure and structuralism. Now, what is ironic about it? What is disastrous? What happened? The point is, interestingly and ironically, in a conference, in an international conference that was meant to talk about Saussure and structuralism, I repeat, in a conference that was meant to talk about and disseminate the ideas of Saussure and structuralism, Derrida presented a paper announcing or declaring the death of structuralism and the monstrous birth of post-structuralism and deconstruction. The word monstrous is used by Derrida himself in his essay, Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences. So, dear friends, I am sure I have clarified the context in which deconstruction was born. So I'll put it in one sentence. In a conference which was meant to talk about structuralism, Derrida presented a paper bearing the title Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourse of the Human Sciences, which announced the death of structuralism and the birth of post-structuralism and deconstruction. So dear friends, this is the first part of my presentation. Now, the second part of the presentation, how do we define deconstruction? Okay, fine. Now, before that, please, sir, can we have the next slide, please? Now, this happened in 1966, the international conference at Johns Hopkins University. Now, the following year, that is 1967, that happened to be a very glorious year for Jacques Derrida, because that was the most productive year for Derrida. Because in 1967, 1 year after the international conference at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, Derrida brought out 3 books, of course, all in French. So the first was Speech and Phenomena, published in 1961. And it was translated from French into English by Allison and Lawler. The second book, it was this book that made him internationally known. Okay, so I repeat, it was this book, the second book, that made Derrida internationally known, that catapulted him to the international arena. The title of the book is, all of us are aware of this book. I am sure some of you have already gone through this book of grammatology. In fact, there is an Indian reprint published by Motilal Banarsidass, so of grammatology. And we Indians, we can be proud of this because it was an Indian, a Columbia University professor, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, who translated this book from French into English. So this happened in 1967. It was only after the publication of this book of grammatology that the international academic community, both literature side and philosophy side, that people came to know about Derrida. So Speech and Phenomena, published in 1967, of Grammatology, published in 1967, and one more book appeared in 1967. And the title is Writing and Difference, and that was translated by Alan Bass. Alan Bass has translated not only this particular book, Writing and Difference, in fact, he has translated other books as well. So dear friends, this is the first part of the presentation. I have clarified, or I have thrown light on the context or the circumstances that led to the birth of deconstruction. Now let us go to the second part of the presentation. Sir, next slide, please. So in the second part of the presentation, we will make an attempt to define deconstruction. But before that, I just want to clarify, because when I talk about Derrida, when I talk about deconstruction, some of my students are confused. Okay, so they would ask me, so post-structuralism, deconstruction, are they same or are they different? Okay, so this slide will clarify. So the question is, what is post-structuralism? What is post-structuralism? What is deconstruction? But more importantly, are they the same or different? Okay, so I will give you three answers. Now, all of us are familiar with Peter Barry Beginning Theory, originally published by Manchester University Press. So if you read Peter Barry's chapter on post-structuralism and deconstruction, he would tell us there is some difference between these two terms, post-structuralism and deconstruction. So he would tell us, while post-structuralism is largely theoretical, deconstruction is more application oriented. So these are the words of Peter Barry. So according to Peter Barry, wherein he talks about the connection or the difference between post-structuralism and deconstruction, Peter Barry would tell us that deconstruction is applied post-structuralism. So post-structuralism is largely theoretical. When you deploy it, particularly when it comes to analyzing a literary text, we are concerned with deconstruction. So according to Peter Barry in Beginning Theory, deconstruction is applied post-structuralism. But then if we ask Terry Eagleton, as we all know, his most important book is Literary Theory and Introduction, particularly the second edition, which is available on the internet. So Terry Eagleton would tell us, oh, don't worry about the differences between post-structuralism and deconstruction. They are almost synonymous. Okay, so while Barry would make some subtle difference between post-structuralism on the one hand and deconstruction on the other, Terry Eagleton will tell us, oh, there is no big difference between these two terms. They are almost synonymous. So we have talked about Barry, we have talked about Eagleton. Next, we will go to Vincent B. Leach. I have taken this quote from his book, American Literary Criticism. But Vincent B. Leach is the general editor of the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism. I am sure your libraries have, maybe some of you have personal copies. So the Norton Anthology of Theory and Criticism, the editor-in-chief is Vincent B. Leach. Earlier, that is towards the late 1980s, he brought out a book bearing the title American Literary Criticism from the 30s to the 80s. So in this book, he talks about the connection between post-structuralism on the one hand and deconstruction on the other. He writes, deconstruction was part of a larger movement, post-structuralism, which derived not only from Derrida, but also from Lacan and Foucault. In other words, he says, post-structuralism is something larger. a wide canvas, a large canvas, whereas deconstruction is part of post-structuralism. Okay, so deconstruction would be subsumed under post-structuralism. So post-structuralism is large, wide, because it includes not only Derrida, it also includes Lacan and Foucault. So therefore, post-structuralism is something large, whereas deconstruction is part of post-structuralism. So dear friends, this slide has clarified the distinction between post-structuralism on the one hand and deconstruction on the other. Now we come to the most important question for today's talk, today's discussion. So the question is, what is deconstruction? How do we define deconstruction? And I have 3 slides. Now, straight away, I would like to make it very clear that the term cannot be defined precisely. The term cannot be defined accurately. Now, some of you may be wondering, so many people have written on post-structuralism, so many have written books, articles, and prepared e-materials on deconstruction. Why is this man telling us that the term cannot be defined precisely and accurately? Okay. Now, here is the short quote from Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, the one who translated Derrida's Of Grammatology from French to English. She writes a long introduction, a lengthy introduction. So in that introduction, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, the translator of Grammatology, she makes it clear. Please allow me to read out this quote. Deconstruction is a perpetually, eternally self-deconstructing movement that is inherited by difference. No text is ever fully deconstructing or deconstructed. In other words, I would like to make 2 points. I would like to make 2 observations. So the question is, what is deconstructions? Are definitions of deconstruction available? Now, the answer to the second question is yes. We have dozens of definitions of deconstruction. Then why did I say that the term cannot be defined precisely and accurately? Now, there is a reason as to why I said, even though definitions of deconstruction are available in plenty, the term cannot be defined precisely and accurately, because that would be the spirit of deconstruction. So what is the true spirit of deconstruction? What is the true philosophy of deconstruction? Whatever definition of deconstruction you come across, even if it is by the best of the critics, even if it is by the best of the theorists, even if it is by the best of philosophers, that definition also should be deconstructed. So that is why Spivak writes, perpetually self-deconstructing, eternally self-deconstructing. So therefore, we don't have any conclusive, any authoritative definition of deconstruction, because true to the spirit of deconstruction, whatever definition of deconstruction we come across, that also should be subjected to scrutiny, and that also should be deconstructed. The next slide, please. Now, in the next slide also, we come across the same idea. Now, this is taken from a philosophy background. So this is an article that appeared in the journal Philosophy Today, and the author is Gary Brent Madison. The title of the article is Coping with Nietzsche's Legacy. He talks about 3 philosophers, 2 Germans, Derrida and Gadamer. He talks about an American, Rorty. He talks about a French philosopher, Derrida, and he talks about a German philosopher, Gadamer. Coping with Nietzsche's Legacy, Rorty, Derrida, and Gadamer. Now, dear friends, please take a look at this definition. I have used 2 different colors, so red and blue. So the first part of the quote says, Madison tells us, yes, of course, deconstruction can be defined. So that is the first part of the quote. But then immediately he backtracks and then he says, no, I'm sorry. What I said was wrong. I'm sorry, deconstruction cannot be defined accurately. So on the one hand, he says, yes, deconstruction can be defined. And on the other, he says, no, I'm sorry, the term cannot be defined. Okay, so let us read the quote. Deconstruction is not a set of theses or beliefs, not even loosely articulated ones, but deconstruction is simply a method. a way of reading texts, philosophical ones in particular. So if you ask Gary Brent Madison, what is deconstruction? How do you define deconstruction? He would tell us it is a way of reading texts, particularly philosophical texts. But having said that, Madison immediately backtracks, immediately takes back his words, and then he says, oh, no, 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 it is not even a method, at least not in the modernist sense of the term. Because if you say it is a method, then you should give us a set of explicit rules to be followed so as to arrive at certain positive results. So in other words, Madison tells us, yes, we can define the term, but at the same time, he tells us the opposite. No, the term cannot be defined. Now, dear friends, I have one more slide making an attempt to define deconstruction. So the first slide, that was Gayatri Spivak. She says, yes, definitions are available, but these definitions should be deconstructed. The second one, Madison tells us, yes, definitions are available. They talk about how to deal with texts, particularly philosophical texts, but then he immediately backtracks and says, I'm sorry, I cannot define deconstruction. The next slide, please. Okay, now, dear friends, this is an important slide. Now, because I'm talking about Derrida and deconstruction, I have to necessarily come up with some acceptable, even though it may not be a perfect one, some acceptable definition of deconstruction, because I cannot get away saying that, oh, the term cannot be defined. Because I'm here to talk about Derrida and deconstruction, I have to make some attempt at defining the term deconstruction, at least a working definition, at least a tentative definition of the term deconstructed. Fine. Now, many, both from literature side and from philosophy side, they would define deconstruction, they would look at deconstruction as an attack on Western metaphysics. Okay, so forget about Spivak, forget about Madison, and let us come to a working definition of deconstruction, a tentative definition of deconstruction. So tentatively, we can define deconstruction as an attack on Western metaphysics. Maybe we can use some adjectives, a harsh attack, a trenchant attack, a ferocious attack. So whatever may be the adjective, it is an attack on Western metaphysics. Now, metaphysics is something broad. It talks about a lot of issues. It talks about a lot of concepts. It talks about a lot of theories. So when we say Derrida attacks Western metaphysics, so we have to narrow down the question, which aspect of metaphysics does he attack? Which dimension of metaphysics does he confront? So we need to give precise answers, okay? So the answer is in two parts. So he attacks Western metaphysics. What does he attack? He attacks Western metaphysics. And what dimensions of metaphysics does he attack? So the answer is he attacks, number one, phonocentrism, and number two, logocentrism. So therefore, a working or a tentative definition of deconstruction would read like this. It is a trenchant attack on traditional Western metaphysics, especially phonocentrism and logocentrism. In other words, it is an attack on the metaphysics of presence. So, dear friends, I have defined deconstruction as an attack on Western metaphysics, an attack on phonocentrism and logocentrism. So now my task for the next 10 minutes or so would be to talk about what is what is metaphysics, what is phonocentrism, and what is logocentrism, and most importantly, why does Derrida attack metaphysics, or why does Derrida attack phonocentrism and logocentrism? So we need to answer three questions. What is metaphysics? Number one. Number two, what is phonocentrism and what is logocentrism? And number three, why does Derrida attack phonocentrism and logocentrism? Fine. Next slide, please. Okay, dear friends, all of us have some idea of philosophy, particularly the basic concepts in philosophy, because philosophy, as we all know, philosophy and literature They are like twins, they are like sisters. Okay, so when we talk of philosophy, the pillars of philosophy would be whether it is Western or Eastern. The pillars of philosophy would be number one, metaphysics, number two, epistemology, number three, logic, and number four, ethics. Epistemology, all of us are aware of it, particularly we study a lot of Foucault. He talks of episteme. So epistemology, as we all know, is the theory of knowledge. Logic talks about rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and persuasive writing. Then ethics talks about moral philosophy, what is right and what is wrong. And we come to metaphysics. So metaphysics talks about the world that is beyond the physical world. Let us analyze the term metaphysics. Let us divide it. So physics, and we have a prefix meta. So meta, as in metaphor, means to go beyond, transcend. So we have the physical world, the empirical world, the observable world, the world that we can see, touch, smell, hear. But there is another world that is beyond. When we talk about God, when we talk about soul, when we talk about the Atman. So this is one meaning of the word metaphysics. Okay, so Paul Deman, sorry, not Paul Deman, Gillis Miller would describe it as suprasensible. Sensible would mean observable or empirical. So going beyond what is empirical, what is observable. So that is suprasensible, that is metaphysics. So that is the first definition of the term metaphysics. Fine. Now, from a philosophical point of view, particularly Aristotle and later Thomas Aquinas, representing scholasticism, scholastic philosophy, they would define metaphysics as study of being as being. Okay, so this is how Aristotle in book 4 of Metaphysics defines metaphysics. He says, please look at the last line, the fourth line. So Aristotle defines metaphysics as science of being qua being, being qua being, being as being. Okay, fine. So there are two beings, science of being, that is being one, qua being as being, being two. So what do these mean? So the first being, so if you look at Western philosophy, okay, so they would define being as that which is. The clock is, therefore the clock is a being. God is, is, therefore God is a being. The bottle is, therefore the bottle is a being. The laptop is, therefore the laptop is a being. He is, therefore he is a being. She is, therefore she is a being. So we are talking about is, okay? And just as we have dark, darkness, good, goodness, so we shall add NESS to IS, and then we have, of course, a clumsy expression, isness. Okay, dark, we add NESS, so it becomes darkness. We have good, we add NESS, so it becomes goodness. So similarly, we define being as that which is, IS, the table is, God is, he is, she is, the watch is, the water bottle is. Okay, so we will add a suffix NESS, so it becomes isness, meaning present. So in other words, let us go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Okay, so how does Derrida define the term metaphysics? Okay, I have already given you two definitions of metaphysics, the physical world, going beyond the physical world. So that is physics, metaphysics, suprasensible. So that is definition one. Definition two, study of being as being, being qua being. This is how Aristotle would define metaphysics. And let us go to Derrida himself. And once again, I will refer to Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, who has written a lengthy preface of grammatology. Somewhere towards the end of her preface, she writes, Derrida uses the word metaphysics simply as a shorthand or an abbreviation for any science of present. So ladies and gentlemen, may I draw your attention to the last word of this short quote. So what is the last word of this quote? Present, presence. And this is precisely what I was talking about with reference to the earlier slide. I talked about isness. And what is isness? IES, then you have a suffix NESS. So what is isness? Presence. Okay, so this is exactly what Spivak talks about. So she says, Derrida uses the term metaphysics to talk about isness, to talk about presence. So dear friends, I said I would answer 3 questions. So the first question is, what is metaphysics? How do we define metaphysics? So the answer is metaphysics is defined as isness, IES, NESS, or presence, as opposed to absence or as opposed to difference, presence. Now let us go to the other 2 terms. What is phonocentrism and what is logocentrism? Can we have the next slide, please? Okay, phonocentrism is very simple. Fine. Now there are 2 things. The first one is Western philosophy, particularly traditional Western philosophy, was fond of binarisms, diets. Okay, and this started from Plato. All of us are familiar with Plato, particularly his Republic, which is in 10 parts. Okay, so it all started with Plato, this binarism, binary thinking, day, night, soul, body, light, darkness. Okay, so one of the binarism says, one of the diets says speech writing. Okay, so we have a list of binaries: soul, body, God, man, transcendent, immanent, speech, writing, presence, absence, man, woman. And we all know 2 things. Number 1, reality is carved up into diets of binarisms. And in binarisms, whenever we talk about binary oppositions or binarisms, the first element is favored. The first element is prioritized. So it is man, then woman. So that is why the woman is referred to the other, the second sex, the inferior sex. Fine. Anyway, so that is a different issue. So it all started with Plato thinking of reality in terms of binarism, binary oppositions. And one of the binary oppositions is speech writing. Now, what comes first? It is always man, woman. It is not woman, man. It is always presence, absence, not absence, presence. So therefore, it is always speech writing. So speech is preferred, speech is privileged. Okay, speech as present. So what is phonocentrism? Phonocentrism is giving priority to speech. Privileging of speech over writing is phonocentrism. Please look at this word phonocentrism, phone, sound, centrism, centered around, focusing. So focusing on sound. Okay, fine. Now here is a very interesting question. Why is speech preferred over writing? Why is speech preferred to writing? Now the answer is very simple. Okay. Now imagine I get a call from my daughter, or I get a call from my mother, or I get a call from my wife. Okay. So the phone, the words, the speech, but behind those words, behind those sounds, we have the embodied presence of a human being. So that is why phonocentrism talks about speech as presence. And the opposite of phonocentrism is graphocentrism. So dear friends, I'll put it in one sentence. So what is phonocentrism? Phonocentrism is when you have to make a choice between speech and writing. You prioritize or you privilege speech over writing. The reason is behind speech, there is the presence of a human being. Speech as presence. And please remember in the earlier slide, we define metaphysics as presence, isness. So here also speech as presence. Now that we have defined phonocentrism, let us talk about what is logocentrism. Next slide, please. Can we have the next slide, please? Next slide. Can we have the next slide? So the next slide, please.
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so dear friends, the next three slides, I'll be talking about what is logocentrism. I'll make an attempt to define logocentrism. So this will be done both from philosophical points of view and also from literary points of view. So I'll be dealing with Richard Kearney. He is a philosopher and he has written an influential book called Modern Movements in European Philosophy. Okay, so here is the short quote from Richard Kearney's book, Modern Movements in European Philosophy. So he writes, Derrida uses the term logocentrism to characterize the recurring propensity, the recurring choice of Western thinking to centralize or ground its understanding on notions of presence. Okay, so I'll explain this a little later. So this is Richard Kearney, and this quote has been taken from Modern Movements in European Philosophy. I have three slides on logocentrism. So shall we move to the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Okay, so next slide. This is a fairly long one. This has been taken from Terry Eagleton. The title of the book is Literary Theory and Introduction, the second edition. So fairly long. I have used two different colors because there are two different ideas. So the first paragraph tells us what is this logocentrism, but the second paragraph tells us, unfortunately, the transcendental signified is absent, not present, but absent. So please look at the first part. Western philosophy has been, in a broader sense, logocentric, committed to a belief in some ultimate word, presence, essence, truth, or reality, which will act as the foundation of all our thought, language, and experience. So this is what he says in the first part of the quote. Then he says, Western philosophy, Western culture, Western civilization has always yearned, thirsted for the sign which will give meaning to all others. And he calls this the transcendental signified, and for the anchoring, unquestionable meaning to which all our signs can be seen to point, that is the transcendental signified. But any such transcendental meaning is a fiction. So dear friends, we have two answers to this question. So the question is, what is logocentrism? What does logocentrism deals with? Monocentrism deals with speech. It prioritizes speech over writing. It privileges speech over writing. Now, what does logocentrism deal with? So the answer is simple. Logocentrism deals with the transcendental signified. So Derrida talks about two kinds of signifieds. Sassou talks about a linguistic signified. Now Derrida doesn't stop with linguistic signified. He goes a step further and he also talks about the transcendental signified. Okay, in a short while, I will clarify what is the signified, both linguistic signified and transcendental signified. So coming back to Eagleton, so trying to answer the question, what is logocentrism or what does logocentrism deal with? Eagleton says, logocentrism deals with the transcendental signified, but then he says, in a tone of regret, he says, unfortunately, this transcendental signified is not present. Okay, so there are 2 points in Terry Eagleton. Logocentrism deals with the transcendental signified, but unfortunately, the transcendental signified is absent, is elusive. Now let us go to the third one. Next slide, please. Okay, now this is taken from Derrida himself. So we were talking about Richard Kearney, a philosopher. We also referred to Terry Eagleton. And what does Terry Eagleton say about logocentrism, the transcendental signified? Now, an important slide. What does Derrida say? Because he is the author. So what does Derrida say about of what does Derrida say about logocentrism in Of Grammatology? Okay, so here is a short quote. So Derrida writes in his book Of Grammatology, the transcendental signified, which at one time or another would place a reassuring end to the reference from sign to sign. I have identified logocentrism and the metaphysics of presence as the exigent, powerful, systematic, and irrepressible desire for such a signified. Okay, so dear friends, I will take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about What is this signified? Because I have talked about, Derrida talks about two categories of signified. He talks about the linguistic signified, and in the same way or in the same breath, he talks about the transcendental signified. Okay. Now let us, from Derrida, let us go back to Ferdinand de Saussure, the father of modern linguistics, and his book, A Course in General Linguistics. Fine. Now, in Course in General Linguistics, Saussure deals with 5 major concepts. I'm not going to talk about all the 5 major concepts, there is no time. I will talk about one major concept. So Saussure talks about the nature or the character of the linguistic sign, SIGN. Okay, so there are 3 questions. So what is the linguistic sign? So Saussure says any word in any language is a linguistic sign. For instance, FAN, fan, it is a linguistic sign. TABLE, table, that is a linguistic sign. Now the second one, all linguistic signs, all words are composed of 2 elements or 2 dimensions or 2 facets, namely the signifier on the one hand and the signified on the other. When I say fan, F-A-N, fan, fan, what am I doing? I'm producing some sounds. I'm producing a sequence of sounds. I'm producing a string of phonemes. So there are 3 phonemes in fan. Okay, so fa, a, no. Okay, so this would be signifier. So signifier is phonological. Signifier is acoustic. It is to do with sounds. Now, when I say fan, what do these sounds refer to? What do these sounds point to? So that would be signified. Okay, so what is linguistic signified? Linguistic signified would be the referent, or if I can loosely talk about the linguistic signified in terms of the word and its meaning, the word and its reference. So that would be the linguistic signified. Now, what is this transcendental signified? The transcendental signified is something, look at Derrida's words, exigent, powerful, systematic, and irrepressible desire for a signified. So in other words, I defined a linguistic signified loosely as word and its meaning, referent. Okay, so that would be at the level of language. That would be within the framework of language. But going beyond language, transcendental signified would refer to that signified or that sign which gives meaning to all our lives. It could be God, it could be reason, it could be an idea, or it could be a form. So it could be anything. Maybe for those who don't believe in God, so they would say an idea or a cause or an ideology. So that would be the transcendental signified, because logos, L-O-G-O-S, logocentrism. So the word logos has 3 meanings. If you look at the origin of the term, if you look at the etymology of the term, logos in Greek, it has 3 meanings. It means reason. That is the first meaning. It also means study, as in phonology, morphology, archaeology, biology, manuscriptology. So the logos would mean study. The third meaning refers to God. Okay, if you want, I can give you this example. Yesterday, I talked about the Bible. I talked about the Old Testament, the New Testament. I said the New Testament, there are 27 books, and the New Testament begins with the 4 Gospels. Gospels, they are an account of the life and teachings of Jesus Christ. So the first Gospel, the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Luke, and the 4th Gospel is the Gospel of St. John. And how does the Gospel of John begins? In the beginning was the Word, W-O-R-D. In Greek, it is logos. So therefore, logos has 3 meanings. So in other words, logocentrism deals with the transcendental signified, but unfortunately, Derrida says this transcendental signified is absent, as a result of which there is only free play. And what was the paper that Derrida presented at the Johns Hopkins University International Conference in 1966? Structure, sign, and play in the discourse of the human sciences. Why play? Because of the differential nature of the linguistic sign according to Saussure, and according to Derrida, the absence of the transcendental signified. We all yearn for the transcendental signified. We all desire for the transcendental signified. We all thirst for the transcendental signified, but unfortunately it is absent. So therefore, we are left only with play. Okay, so dear friends, this slide talks about the connection between phonocentrism and logocentrism. Because how did I define deconstruction? I came up with a working definition or a tentative definition of deconstruction, and I defined deconstruction as an attack on Western metaphysics, especially phonocentrism and logocentrism. So phonocentrism, speech versus writing, and speech is more important than writing. Logocentrism, the search for a transcendental signified, but unfortunately we realize that the transcendental signified is not present but absent, and therefore it leads to free play. Now this slide talks about how do we connect logocentrism and phonocentrism. In other words, these are two dimensions of metaphysics, phonocentrism and logocentrism. And I want you to go back. How did we define metaphysics? We define metaphysics as suprasensible, number one. Number two, study of being, qua being. This is how Aristotle defines metaphysics in his book 4 of his metaphysics, and Derrida talks about metaphysics in terms of presence. Okay, so now the question is, how do we connect phonocentrism and logocentrism? So the common thread or the linking thread, that which links phonocentrism and logocentrism, is presence. Phonocentrism privileges speech, and logocentrism talks about the search for a transcendental signified. Both talk about the presence. Okay, so that is why in an earlier slide I talked about the metaphysics of presence. Okay, so dear friends, let me conclude the second part of my presentation. I would like to draw your attention to an essay published by Derrida with the title Difference. And please look at the spelling. There is an accent above E. This is not an English word, but a French word. Originally, it was delivered as a lecture in 1968. So originally it was a lecture, but later Derrida published it as an article, 1968. And as we all know, because some of us, I'm sure, will be teaching literary theory, particularly structuralism, post-structuralism, and deconstruction, we all know that difference is a combination of two verbs. It is Derrida's own coinage. It is a portmanteau word. So what are the two words embedded in the expression difference, a French word? To differ and to defer. So dear friends, it is in this context that I would like to talk about three important concepts of Derrida. And what are the three important concepts of Derrida? I would very briefly talk about palimpsest, trace, and dissemination. Fine. Now, how do I explain this palimpsest, trace, and difference? Now, what is this palimpsest? I'm sure you already have an idea. Now, I'll give you two examples. What happened in the early Egyptian context in early Egypt, and what happened in early India. Now, today we have pen and paper. Okay, so we write on a sheet of paper, and if that sheet of paper is over, I can always buy or borrow another sheet of paper. If I run out of ink, then I can always buy a new ball pen, or I can change the refill. But those days, whether it was Egypt or India, there was no pen, there was no paper. So in India, they used palm leaves. They used palm leaves, and they had a stylus. Particularly in South India, they used palm leaves, leaves from the palmera tree. So palm leaves and a stylus, something like a nail. So with the help of that stylus, they wrote on palm leaves. Now even this was not available in plenty. So scarcity of material. So what did they do? Please believe me, I am not exaggerating. This is what archaeologists and manuscriptologists would tell us. So there are layers and layers of writing. Why? Shortage of material, dearth of material. Now there's something similar happened in Egypt. They did not have pen and paper, so therefore they used wax, W-A, wax tablets, and they had a stylus. And once again, because of the scarcity of material. Okay, we have layers and layers of writing. Now, dear friends, I want you to take it both in the literal meaning and in the metaphorical meaning. So, in other words, let us go back to Saussure. Because of the differential nature of the linguistic sign, I repeat, because of the differential nature of the linguistic sign, every signifier contains traces of all other signifiers, and it doesn't stop with the signifier. Every signified as well contains traces of all the other signifieds, as a result of which meaning is disseminated, meaning is scattered all over. This is the concept of palimpsest trace and dissemination. And Eagleton writes, if every sign is what it is because it is not all the others, every sign would be made up of a potentially infinite trace of differences. I told you the palm leaves or the wax tablets, we have layers, layers of writing, both literally and metaphorically. So this is different. So when do we arrive at meaning? We have the word, we have the meaning, and you match it. I repeat, you have the signifier, you have the signified. When you match it, then we have the meaning. But here what happens? It is a free floating signifier. I repeat, it is a freely floating signifier, and it is a freely floating signified. So in other words, there is no marriage between the signifier and the signified. The word and the meaning, they are not put together. As a result of which, please look at the last line. There is only free play. There is only undecidability. So dear friends, I know I have taken a lot of time. So in the first part of my presentation, I talked about the context, the environment that led to the birth of deconstruction. I drew your attention to the international conference at Hopkins University in October 1966. And I told you that in a conference meant to talk about structuralism, Derrida presented a paper where he announced the death of structuralism and the birth of post-structuralism and deconstruction. That was the first part. Now the second part, how do we define deconstruction? Okay, so deconstruction is an attack on Western metaphysics, especially phonocentrism and logocentrism. We define metaphysics as presence, isness, presence, and phonocentrism as privileging of speech over writing, and logocentrism as the search for signified. So what links up, what connects all the three is presence, metaphysics of presence. But unfortunately, the transcendental signified is absent. Therefore, we are left with a free play or undecidability. Fine. So, dear friends, we will move to the third part. I will not discuss the third part elaborately. So, the third part is how do we deconstruct a text? Okay. So, I'll be skipping some slides. Can we have the next slide, please? Excuse me, can we have the next slide? Okay, fine. Next slide. So this is the slide on difference where I talked about palimpsest, trace, and dissemination. Okay, so the title of this slide is how to deconstruct a text. In fact, I have 3 slides. So this one has been taken from a very important essay by Christopher Norris, and he has also written a wonderful book, a truly wonderful book on Derrida. The title of the book is Derrida. I will talk about it in my last slide. Okay, so this is Christopher Norris, what it means to deconstruct a text. And let us go to the next slide. Next slide, please. Next slide. Can we have the next slide?
Yes, sir.
Okay, so the next slide, I'm referring to an essay. Please look at the last line. I'm referring to a brilliant essay by Hillis Miller. And the title of the essay is The Critic as Host. I'm sure most of you would have read this essay because it is usually prescribed for the MPhil program. So please read this essay if you have not read it. So it is by Hillis Miller. And who is Hillis Miller? Hillis Miller was one of the Yale deconstructors. There were 4 professors of English at Yale University, the Department of English. And all the 4 English professors were disciples of Derrida. So therefore, they were known as Yale deconstructors. And Hillis Miller was one of the Yale deconstructors. He has written a brilliant essay called The Critic as Force. And this is an interesting, there is an interesting background to this essay. It was originally delivered as a talk at an MLA conference, Modern Language Association conference. So M.H. Abrams supposed to be one of the leading figures of liberal humanism. Okay, M.H. Abrams, he presented a paper with the title The Deconstructive Angel. And as a response, Hillis Miller presented a paper, The Critic as Soul. So these 2 papers should be read together. M.H. Abrams, The Deconstructive Angel, which is a harsh attack on Derrida and deconstruction. And it was followed by Hillis Miller's response with the essay, a brilliant essay, The Critic as Soul, where he argues language deconstructs itself. So what is marked in blue is language deconstructing itself. So this is deconstruction. Fine. Now let us go to the next slide. Can we have the next slide, please? Next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Okay, so dear friends, now the question is, okay, so far we have been talking about theory. Okay, largely from a philosophical point of view, I am aware of it. So far we have been talking about the theory of deconstruction, the theory of Derrida, largely from a philosophical perspective, from a philosophical point of view. Now we are all students and teachers of literature. So when we take up a novel, when we take up a poem, when we take up a short story, how do we apply the deconstructive philosophical framework? In other words, how do we deconstruct a text? Now, here is an example. Okay, so this is not my example. So this is from Paul de Man. Okay, I'm sure you're familiar with this essay. Please look at the second paragraph printed in blue. A brilliant essay once again. The title of the essay is Semiology and Rhetoric. Paul de Man, originally from Belgium, later emigrated to the United States of America. And then he was also caught in a controversy because he was supposed to have supported Nazism. Okay, so therefore he was blacklisted. Anyway, that is another story. So this example has been taken from Paul de Man's Semiology and Rhetoric. Okay, now please go to the first part of the slide. Now, all of us are familiar with W.B. Yeats, particularly his poem Among School Children, a widely anthologized poem. I'm sure it is prescribed in many colleges and universities, particularly at the undergraduate level. I'm sure many of you have taught this poem among school children. And I'm sure many of you remember the last line of the poem, how can we know the dancer from the dance? So this is the last line. Okay, and there is a question mark. Please don't miss the question mark. So the poem ends with these words, how can we know the dancer from the dance? Fine. Now, if you were to interpret this line, if you were to teach this poem, how will you explain the last sentence? Okay, so immediately we go to established critics of W.B. Yeats. So one of the most authoritative critics of W.B. Yeats would be Hunter Trucker. Of course, there are others as well. Okay, in fact, Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak, she wrote a PhD thesis on the poetry of W.B. Yeats. So she is also one of the authorities on W.B. Yeats. But it is widely accepted and recognized that Hunter Trucker is the authority on W.B. Yeats and his poetry. So if you were to ask Hunter Trucker, he would tell you, oh, don't worry about the question mark at the end. This is not a question as such. This is a rhetorical question. So what is a rhetorical question? We all know. Even though it is in the form of a question, it is actually not a question. It is a rhetorical question. A rhetorical question is one that does not require an answer. Okay, so how can we know the dancer from the dance? Undertaker and others would tell us, please ignore the question mark. It is not a proper question. Okay, fine. But Paul Demand says, no, I am a Derridian. I am a disciple of Derrida. So I would like to read this poem, this line differently, different from others, even from Undertaker. So he says, for me, the question mark matters. I will not look at it as a rhetorical question. Instead, I will look at it as a question that requires an answer, that demands an answer. So what does he do, dear friends? Please look at the last two lines. So how do we deconstruct a test? And here is an example. Paul Deman analyzing W.B. Yeats's poem Among School Children. And we come across this in his brilliant essay, Semiology and Rhetoric. What does he do? Okay. So I want you to remember only one phrase from my entire lecture. Okay, forget about the details. Okay, you may not remember what I said about metaphysics, about phonocentrism, about graphocentrism, maybe a few months from now. But I want you to remember this phrase because this would sum up deconstruction. So what is deconstruction? How do we deconstruct a poem? How do we deconstruct a novel? How do we deconstruct a film? Reading against the grain. Okay, so I want you to remember this phrase and this phrase alone. So my entire lecture today can be summarized in this phrase, reading against the grain. Okay, in other words, it also means oppositional reading. Okay, fine. So what is this reading against the grain? I want you to pay attention to the preposition against the grain. So which means we can also say reading along the grain. Okay, reading along the grain and reading against the grain. So dear friends, this is basically a metaphor taken from carpentry. I repeat, this is basically a metaphor taken from carpentry. And imagine there is a piece of wood. It is not smooth. It is a little rough. The carpenter has to smoothen it out, has to polish it. So he has a gadget in his hand. And with that gadget, with the help of that gadget, he smoothens the rough edges and then he polishes it. Now the question is, how does he move the gadget? In what direction? Is it towards him or away from him? Is
Away.
it along the grain or is it against the grain? Now the answer is, next time when a carpenter is at work, at least out of curiosity, please spend 2 or 3 minutes observing how he moves that gadget. Is it towards his body or away from his body? Is it along the grain or against the grain? So if he has to polish it, it has to be against the grain, not along the grain. So what is the meaning of reading against the grain? It is an oppositional reading. Traditional critics, including Anta Trekker, would say, how can we know the dancer from the dance? The ultimate line of W.B. Yeats's poem Amongst School Children, you look at it as a rhetorical question. This is reading along the grain. But you are a Derridian. You are a deconstructor. So what are you required to do? You should read against the grain. No, I will not listen to Anta Trekker and other traditional Yeatsian critics. I will read it against the grain. I will indulge in an oppositional reading. So this is deconstructing a test, dear friends. In other words, we are left with two readings, whether it is a poem or a short story or a novel or an essay or a film, we are left with the two readings. What are the two readings? The traditional reading and the oppositional reading. The traditional reading is known as the logocentric reading. The traditional reading, we go by established critics like Anta Trekker. Anta Trekker has said that this is a rhetorical question, full stop, period. No more argument, no more discussion. Anta Trekker himself has said, you need not answer this question because it is a rhetorical question. So that is reading along the grain, logocentric. But Paul Deman would say, I am a Derridian, I am a deconstructor. I would engage in reading against the grain and oppositional reading. Dear friends, So we have two readings of any text, that is a logocentric reading and a deconstructive reading. A logocentric reading is reading along the grain, and a deconstructive reading is an oppositional reading. Okay. Now, sir, can you please come to slide number 22? Deconstruction in operation. Second of the third slide. No, the previous one, please. The previous one. Okay, thank you. So, dear friends, I will read this quote, and with that I will stop the third part of the presentation. So Eagleton says, the tactic of deconstructive criticism is to show how texts come to embarrass their own ruling systems of logic. Okay, and please look at the last two lines, where texts get into trouble, come unstuck, offer to contradict themselves. So look at the word. Texts embarrass themselves, texts contradict themselves. In other words, texts deconstruct themselves. How do they deconstruct themselves? When you engage them in an oppositional reading, when you read against the grain instead of along the grain, when you indulge in a deconstruct reading as opposed to a logocentric reading, you realize the text embarrass themselves. So dear friends, that was the third part of my presentation. And let me conclude. Sir, please take this slide number 26. Yale deconstructors. Next one. Next one. Okay, fine. So we have four Yale deconstructors. All the four of them were philosophers, all the four of them were professors of English, and they were at Yale University because Derrida was for some time a visiting professor at Yale University. Then later he went over to California. Okay, so towards the end of his life, he was in California, but he spent a considerable amount of time at Yale University as a visiting professor, and he had four American disciples, all professors of English. They were Paul Deman, Jeffrey Hartman, Ellis Miller, and Harold Bloom. All four were professors of English at Yale, and they are known as Yale deconstructors. And if there is time, later on, you please read this book published in 1979. So these four Yale critics, Paul Deman, Jeffrey Hartman, Hillis Miller, Harold Bloom, along with Derrida, they published a book bearing the title Deconstruction and Criticism. And Derrida's essay is there, a tough essay, but you can still read it. So that was published in 1969. Fine. So dear friends, I will take 3 more minutes. Let us go to the last but one. The previous one, the penultimate slide. So, sir, can we go back to the previous slide? Slide number 25. Okay, fine. So this is the last part of my presentation. So the first part of the presentation, I talked about the birth of deconstruction. The second part of the presentation, I made an attempt to answer the question, what is deconstruction? Third part of the presentation, I talked about the strategies that we can adopt when it comes to deconstructing literary texts. Now, finally, how do we evaluate Derrida? How do we assess Derrida? As we all know, Derrida died in 2004. So when he died, okay, obituaries were written. And if you look at the obituaries, okay, they were all very different, written from different perspectives. And Derrida died in 2004. His wife, his widow, died recently. She died of COVID. She died during the second COVID wave. Unfortunate. She was a psychoanalyst. She died during the second wave. Anyway, now let us go back to Derrida. So Derrida died in 2004. So when he died, there were a lot of questions. Okay. So there were 4 questions. Was he a skeptic? Or was he a nihilist, a philosopher of nothingness? Or was he a maverick, not a true philosopher, but pretending to be one, trying to get attention? Or was he a radical philosopher, a radical thinker who taught us to challenge everything, who taught us to challenge tradition, who taught us to read against the grain, who taught us to indulge in an oppositional reading? So it is for us to decide, was he a skeptic or a nihilist or a mere maverick playing to the gallery, or was he a radical thinker, a radical theorist, a radical philosopher who taught us to look at life, to look at reality, to look at text in a radically new way, reading against the grain, oppositional reading? So it is for you to decide. And this is my last slide. So can we have the last slide, please? Okay, so dear friends, I'm sure some of you may be interested in knowing more about Derrida. Okay, I would like to give you a reading list. So the first one is an essay, a brilliant essay by Paul de Man. I've already referred to this essay because it is in this essay, Semiology and Rhetoric, published in 1973, that he analyzes W.B. Yeats's poem among school children, particularly the way he analyzes the last sentence, the last line, the ultimate line. How do we know the dancer from dance? That is supposed to be a paradigmatic example of deconstruction. Then I'm referring to this book, McQuillan, Deconstruction, a Reader. It contains an essay by Christopher Norris. So that is a brilliant essay. Then the third one, Hillis Miller, another Yale deconstructor. He has written a brilliant essay, The Critical Source, that was published in 1977. I have already referred to this essay. So this was at an MLA conference, and this was a response to the presentation made by M.H. Abrams, the deconstructive angel. So the deconstructive angel, M.H. Abrams, attacks Derrida and deconstruction, and he attacks them using the expression double agents. Okay, and in response, Hillis Miller made this presentation, The Critique as Host, where he says language deconstructs itself. Language deconstructs itself, oppositional reading. Then there is a brilliant book by Derrida titled Derrida by Christopher Norris, 1987. Okay, in my opinion, this is the best book on Derrida that I have come across. Recently, Routledge brought out a book on Derrida titled Jacques Derrida, that was in 2003 by Nicholas Royal. The book is good, but not as good as Christopher Norris's book. Fine, now those of you who want to access Derrida in the original, I would suggest this book by Routledge, published in 2007, edited by Barry Stocker. It is titled Jacques Derrida Basic Writings. It has a very good introduction, an insightful introduction, and extracts from all major books and essays. So it is a valuable book. Please go through it. So dear friends, with that, I wrap up my presentation on Derrida and deconstruction. So please remember this expression, reading against the grain. So what is deconstruction? Reading against the grain. And reading against the grain is oppositional reading. You don't go by traditional reading. You look at it anew. You indulge in an oppositional reading. You read against the grain, not only a text, but even life, even reality. So that would be the legacy of Derrida. Thank you very much. And my special thanks to Professor Kapil Singhel. Thank you. And my thanks to Dr. Prantik Banerjee, also my friend from Hislop College, Nagpur. Dear friends, in case you have any question, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.
So it was an eye-opening and wonderful session. I thoroughly enjoyed it, sir. My only problem was that the slides were not moving fast enough. I mean, we could not keep up with what you were saying and connect with the images.
I'm sorry about it.
But it was so thrilling to actually understand all the theory properly. I could, for a change, pay attention and understand everything. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, ma'am.
Hello, sir. This is Ashwin Patil from MB Patel College, Sadakarjani.
Yes,
I have a question.
Yes, please.
While reading Derrida for our masters, I came across one sentence. While reading about logocentrism, there was an expression that rat is rat only because it is not cat. So that particular the concept of difference, that is different is there. So while reading Derrida, I came across one sentence that is center is at the center of totality, but yet it does not belong to totality. And while finding an explanation for this particular sentence, I came across one example of onion. Center is like, peeling of the onion. We just keep on peeling onion, yet we somewhere do not find that exact center. So what does it mean? I haven't found any justified answer for this. It is still a riddle for me to understand this particular sentence. Center is at the center of totality, yet it does not belong to totality.
Okay, fine. Thank you for the interesting question. Now, let me make an attempt at answering this question. Now, deconstruction is also known as decentering. Okay, so deconstruction is also known as decentering. I define deconstruction as an attack on Western metaphysics, especially an attack on phonocentrism and logocentrism, though that is one way of looking at deconstruction. Now, a person called Steve O'Connor, I repeat, Steve O'Connor, he has defined deconstruction as decentering. Okay, so what does he mean by decentering? Fine. Now, you gave the example of onion. I will take a different example.
Yes.
Okay, so let us take a classroom. Okay, in a traditional classroom, maybe not in a modern classroom, in a traditional classroom, what constitutes the center? It is the teacher who is at the center, not necessary that the teacher is standing at the center of the classroom. Okay, it is not center in mathematical terms. It is center in hierarchical terms. So the teacher is the center of the classroom. The man is the center of the family. Okay, I mean, I'm talking of traditional homes, traditional families from a patriarchal point of view. Okay, fine. So in a typical classroom, which is considered a structure, the teacher would be the center. Now imagine a lot of noise is coming from a particular classroom. Immediately the headmaster or the principal would say, please check if the teacher is there. Why? The assumption is, had the teacher been there, had the center been there, there would not have been so much noise. There would not have been so much free play. So therefore, there are two possibilities. Either there is no center, the teacher is absent, or the center is powerless. The teacher is too lenient to control the students. As a result of which, there is a lot of noise from that classroom. So you begin to wonder whether the center was there or it is. There are two possibilities. Either it is a centerless universe or a centerless structure where the teacher is absent, or it is a decentered structure where the teacher is present, but the teacher is busy correcting some assignment or like counseling a particular student, as a result of which not paying attention to the others. So this is how Steve O'Connor in his encyclopedia article on Derrida and deconstruction would define deconstruction as decentering. Have I answered your question, sir?
Yes, sir. Thank you so much for such a lucid explanation, sir.
Thank you.
Another question is there. Can we arrive at the final meaning of any of the words? I think the whole idea of deconstruction is that we cannot arrive at the final meaning.
Okay, now the deconstructors would talk of indeterminacy. They are very fond of using two words. They use the word indeterminacy and they also use the term undecidability. Okay, but let us take it with a pinch of salt. So when they say meaning cannot be arrived at, let us not take it literally. Of course, we can arrive at meanings, but the point is, let us deconstruct that meaning also. So if you remember the first slide, okay, the topic was how do we define deconstruction? So let us take a look at the first slide. So the first slide says, Spivak herself says, it is a perpetually deconstructing exercise. So which means meaning can be arrived at, certainly. Okay, but the spirit of deconstruction is you scrutinize that meaning also. You deconstruct that meaning also. Okay, there is a second meaning, there is a third meaning, there is a fourth meaning. You keep on deconstructing it. So that is the spirit of deconstruction. So let us not take it literally when they talk about indeterminacy, undecidability, when they talk about aporia, A-P-O-R-I-A. Okay, let us not take them literally. The idea is it should be deconstructed further. Okay, perpetual, eternal. So that is the idea. So let us not have a laid back attitude. I have understood this poem once and for all. There can be no other reading. There can be no other interpretation. No, this is one way of looking at it. There could be another way. There could be another perspective. There could be another viewpoint. So that is the spirit of deconstruction.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Anyone else? Any question? Okay, sir.
Yes,
So,
sir.
yeah. Thanks a lot. Sir has divided his presentation into three broad parts. The birth of deconstruction, then what is deconstruction, and how to deconstruct a text. And sir has really contributed to this course through these two wonderful lectures. So on behalf of the participants and the HRD department of Nagpur University, I'm thankful to sir for sparing his time and contributing to this course. So thanks a lot, sir, once again. And I declare that the session is over, and we shall be meeting tomorrow again at the same time at the regular time. That is at around 10:30 in the morning. Okay.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And thank you, participants. Hoping to meet you in person one day. Thank you. And wish
Yes,
you all
sir.
the best.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.